Imagine it was so hot outside you could actually die. It's July 13th, 1896. You live in New York City. It's the hottest day of the year. In fact, it's been the hottest day for 4 straight weeks. The temperature is around 106 degrees Fahrenheit or 41.1 Celsius. Since June, there has not been one day below 90 degrees Fahrenheit or 30.2 Celsius. You walk outside and instantly break into a sweat. It's hard to do anything. Walking up a flight of stairs can leave you gasping for breath. Now, you're thinking this must end soon, right? Wrong. From now until the 17th, the temperature will continue to rise. By the 16th, it will reach 109 degrees Fahrenheit or 43.3 Celsius, which at the time was a record high temperature for the entire world. What's going on? Why is it so hot? And how did thousands die from it? Welcome to my channel. Today we are taking a look back at the 1896 Eastern North America heat wave. Before we get into it though, I just want to thank you guys so much for the support that you have shown me. Now let's get into the video. The heat wave started in late June with temperatures rising steadily throughout the month. On July, it hit 100 degrees Fahrenheit or 38 degrees Celsius. Then came the 11th, which saw the mercury rise even further to 104 degrees Fahrenheit or 40 degrees Celsius. At this point, people were starting to get worried. Even more worryingly, meteorologists said that it didn't look like it would cool down anytime soon. As you can imagine, people tried everything they could to cool themselves down. They slept outdoors, out on their porches, or in the streets, anywhere where they could catch a breeze. Others went to public places such as parks and train stations, which had fans to circulate the air. Some tried to take refuge in basements, but they were often no cooler than the street level. Many people also tried to travel out of the city, but trains were packed and tickets were non-refundable. Those who tried to head north soon found out why they shouldn't have bothered. Temperatures in Canada were just as high as they were in New York. On the 12th, schools were closed and business was suspended. People were told to stay indoors if they could and avoid physical exertion. This is about as much as authorities could do. They didn't have much of an idea as to why the heat was so bad. However, looking back, we now know that a combination of high atmospheric pressure and an absence of rainfall created a heat dome over the eastern United States and southeastern Canada. Also, since the Gulf Stream had been particularly warm that year, when the heat wave hit, it was able to hang around for longer. Now let's go back to those poor people suffering through the heat wave. As the days passed, things became increasingly dire. Streetcars were still running, but there were so few passengers that they had to be coupled together to make the journey worthwhile. Now, this may sound contradicting, but even though people were advised to stay indoors, many people chose to spend their days outdoors. After all, inside their homes it was just as hot and they had nothing else to do. With life pretty much coming to a standstill, people spent their days wandering around or sitting outside talking. On the 16th, the sun reached its zenith and reached a sweltering 109 degrees Fahrenheit or 43.3 degrees Celsius. This beat the previous world record set just 2 years prior in Chicago of 107.1 degrees Fahrenheit or 41.7 degrees Celsius. Sadly, by this point, the death toll was already starting to rise. The victims were mostly the elderly and very young, although some of them were perfectly healthy. Over the next 3 days, 2,600 people died. In total, the heat wave claimed 1,500 lives in New York alone. Most of them died at home, and their bodies were left undiscovered for days. Authorities did their best to deal with the mass casualties, but there were simply too many bodies to transport and bury quickly enough. They opened up mass graves in the city's poor neighborhoods. On Hart Island, the city's potter's field, 2,000 bodies were buried. When the heat wave finally broke on July, relief was widespread. People poured out into the streets, overjoyed that the ordeal was over. But it wasn't. While it had broken in New York, it had only just begun in other parts of the country. In fact, the heat wave went on to affect an area of over 6,000 square miles or 15,000 square kilometers. Temperatures remained above 100 degrees Fahrenheit or 37.8 degrees Celsius for 2 weeks. There were deaths in Philadelphia, Baltimore, Washington, D.C., Pittsburgh, Cleveland, Detroit, and Buffalo. Boston escaped the worst of it, but temperatures there still reached a sweltering 99 degrees Fahrenheit or 37.2 degrees Celsius. To put that in perspective, the average July temperature there is just 76 degrees Fahrenheit or 24.4 degrees Celsius. The heat wave caused chaos across the country. Sports events were canceled, factories shut down, and farms suffered major losses. Trains couldn't run on time because the heat warped the wooden railway sleepers. In some cases, telegraph lines failed because the heat made the wires sag too low to connect properly. The heat wave even interrupted the presidential campaign. That year, William McKinley faced off against Democratic candidate and former President Grover Cleveland. McKinley was nearing the Republican nomination and wanted to visit New York to secure his party's support. His advisors strongly advised against it, believing that he would be risking his life. Ultimately, McKinley listened to reason and stayed at home. He ultimately won the presidency and went on to be assassinated 6 months later by an anarchist. For some, the heat wave turned into a financial windfall. Anyone with an icebox or an awning did a brisk trade selling refreshments. One man saw his ice business triple in value, earning him a $10,000 profit. Newspapers also did well for several days. Sales went through the roof as people used them to prop open windows and block out the sun. But for most, the heat wave was a miserable experience. Some were confined to bed, unable to move without breaking into a sweat. One woman talked about how she felt her muscles grow cold and stiff. She managed to pull through, but sadly, many others weren't so lucky. So far, we've discussed how it started, how it progressed, and the overall impact it had. Now let's focus on the casualties. We already mentioned that about 1,500 people died in New York, but that was only a fraction of the overall death toll. Between July and 10th, around 2,800 Americans died. This included 2,000 African Americans. The heat wave also took 11 Canadian lives. Most of the victims were elderly or very young, but there were exceptions. One 10-year-old girl died while visiting a doctor. Perhaps the most famous victim was the boxer James J. Corbett. He had been planning to fight in a big event but never made it. On the 16th, he complained of feeling sick and collapsed shortly after. He was taken to hospital, but doctors were unable to save him. He died of a heart attack brought on by the heat. At first, nobody was too concerned about the heat wave's death toll. After all, the population of the US at the time was about 62 million. A few thousand deaths wouldn't make much of an impact. However, people's opinions changed once newspapers started to report the true numbers. An author wrote a story about the heat wave in the Atlantic Monthly, but he greatly exaggerated the death toll, claiming that it was closer to 10,000. This led to outrage across the nation and calls for better treatment of the poor. After all, it was the poorer communities that suffered the most. They couldn't afford air conditioning or to travel out of the city. While the death toll was terrible, it could have been much worse. Authorities took quick action to try and prevent things from getting out of hand. They opened public baths, gave free water to the poor, and banned open flames to try and prevent fires. As the saying goes, though, every cloud has a silver lining. The heat wave marked the beginning of the end for central air conditioning. Before then, it had only really been used in factories, mills, and large buildings. Now that people saw just how useful it could be, people began installing it in their homes. Unfortunately, it was a long time before air conditioners became affordable. But by the 1950s, almost half of all American families had one. Ultimately, the heat wave was a disaster. Thousands of people lost their lives. It disrupted daily life and caused billions of dollars in damage. But it also forced people to take a closer look at how they lived and worked.